All right. Welcome, everyone. We'll take just another minute or so to let folks in out of the waiting room. I know we got a bigger audience attending today. This is the first time that we made one of our base camps open to the public, and we're doing that in recognition of Mental Health Awareness Month and also to spread our special guest message and research, because I think it's effective and something that everyone should have access to. So give just another few seconds and then we'll get started. And while we're waiting for people to join in, Ethan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm delighted to see all these faces streaming in. You know, sometimes these talks I only get to see myself, which I don't particularly care to just look at for an hour. So it's great to see these different faces right in front of me.
Amazing, amazing. And Andrew, are you doing all right today?
Doing great. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and we have so many folks logging on to join today. It's terrific.
Amazing, amazing. Awesome. All right. Well, we've got a lot to cover and a short amount of time to do it. So we'll get started, and people will filter in as they filter in. Andrew and I are excited to welcome everyone to today's base camp, our growing Made4 community, and especially our special guest, Ethan Kross. Ethan is a psychologist, director of the Emotion and Self-Control Lab, and professor at the University of Michigan, and also a well-regarded author of Chatter, The Voice in Our Head and Why It Matters. He's one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind. And credentials aside, Ethan is a genuinely nice person and cares deeply about getting science and research out of the lab and into your hands so that you can live a happier, healthier life. And for that, we are certainly aligned in the way that we see things at Made4. So we couldn't be more excited to have you here today, Ethan. Thanks for joining. I would love to set the stage just quickly with a brief story, and then we'll jump into a discussion around Ethan's research and work. The story is this. I went through SEAL training a number of years ago, and one part of SEAL training is this week called Hell Week. You stay awake and you're cold and you're wet for a week. You don't really sleep very much. You're constantly moving around. And I have this distinct memory. The second day of Hell Week, I think we were 30 hours in. We were really cold. We were tired. We were wet, all the things. And we were going back out into the surf zone to do another round of what the instructors called surf torture, where they let us lay down in the Pacific Ocean and get borderline hypothermic before they pull us out and just repeat the process over and over again. And getting ready to go back into the ocean. And my friend Garrett, one of my classmates, and later teammates, elbowed me and he said, "Yo, Patty." And I said, "What's up, Garrett?" He said, "These instructors are idiots." I said, "Oh my God, why are they idiots, Garrett?" And he said, "Because they think they can make us colder than we already are, and they are dumb for that." And I said, "All right," kind of laughed and we chuckled and we went about our day. About 15 hours later, we were, by this point, half our class had quit. We were getting ready to head back into the surf again for another round of surf torture. The sun had just set, and Garrett elbows me again. He happened to be just right next to me as we were going into the water. He elbows me again. And he says, "Yo, Patty." And I said, "Yeah, Garrett." He said, "I was wrong." And what struck me about that, and why I tell that story, is because for the remainder of that week, for the next 5 days, that we were awake and moving and cold and wet, anytime that my mind started to race towards a negative spot, or started to get the event in front of me started to get to seem too large, I would just have that script replay in my head. I would say, "Yo, Patty, I was wrong." And something about that made me laugh, pulled me out of the moment, and allowed me to continue to move through the challenge at hand. So today, a broad brush outline is this. We all have an inner voice, and this is generally a good thing. It's something that serves us very well in life. But there are times when that inner voice can turn negative. It can turn to rumination, what Ethan calls chatter. And when that happens, it can limit you. For some, this may feel like an acute event. It may be, I'm going to tank today's base camp and everyone's going to laugh at me. For others, it may seem like more of a chronic thing, like you have the world's worst teammate inside your head, always telling you to focus on the bad things and everything that's going to go wrong. constantly directing your attention to these things. In either case, Ethan's work shows us that you have an ability to exert control when the dial of chatter turns up, and that you have this ability to better manage that chatter so that you can be your own best teammate and ultimately unlock your full potential. So with that as kind of a broad brushstroke overview of what we're going to talk about today, maybe turn it over to Ethan and ask, why do you do this research? What excites you about it? And yeah,
Sure. Well, I love that story, and it actually embodies several of the tools I talk about in Chatter. I'll just say my book. It gets confusing to talk about like the phenomenon of chatter and then a book called Chatter. You could get a little tongue twisted there. So, but we talk. You mentioned a few tools that are actually, we know through science, are helpful for helping people manage it. So we'll come back to it. But I've been doing research on chatter and how to manage it for over 20 years. But my interest in the topic goes back a lot further, more like 38 years. And I'm not that much older than that. So really from the time I was a little kid, I was thinking about these things. And the quick 2-minute version of this story is, I had an unconventional dad. He loved smoking, loved cursing, loved the Yankees, but he also loved Eastern philosophy and was consumed by it. Not a college grad, but he spent his spare time meditating and reading the Yoga Sutras. And when he wasn't doing that, he was talking to me, starting from the time I was about 3 years old, about what he was learning. And one of the lessons was, when bad things happen, turn your attention inward, try to work through the problem and come up with a solution. So essentially introspect, use your mind to solve the problem and then move on. And I didn't really know any different when I was 3 years old. So I love this guy, still do. And I internalized that message, and I used this as a tool throughout my childhood and adolescence. When things happened, fights with my mother, rejections from girls that I asked out on dates, more rejections from girls that I asked out on dates, and I could keep going on that note. I would use this tool. I turn inward. All right, Ethan, what are you going to do here? How are you going to manage the situation? And I come up with an answer and move on. Then I got to college and I took my first psychology class. And about halfway through the semester, we got to the topic of introspection. And what I learned is, on the one hand, there were a lot of people who did the same thing that my dad told me to do, and they benefited a lot from doing so. There was value to this kind of self-reflection. But on the other hand, there was an equal number of people out there who did the exact same thing, but it backfired. It led them to feel worse. They'd start ruminating and worrying and catastrophizing. And this, to me, became this giant puzzle. Why is it that this capacity that we have to use our mind to solve our problems sometimes helps us, but other times hurts us? And so I went to graduate school to figure out how to use science to weigh in on that question and really identify tools that people can use to harness the power of their mind to work through their problems, and really language, right? Self-talk, how we can use the words streaming through our head to feel better. And I've been doing research on that ever since.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I know we had talked at the outset that we wanted to spend most of the time focused on the tools, but I'd love maybe just a brief explanation of how does that inner voice that we have serve us? Like, where is it an asset to us and help us move through our day?
Great question. And I love the opportunity to weigh in on this at the outset, just to kind of set the stage. So when scientists talk about this voice in our head, what we're referring to is our ability to use language silently, to reflect on our lives. The ability to do this, to use language silently, this is a really remarkable human capacity that helps us do many, many different things. I often like to refer to it as one of the mind's Swiss Army knives. So let me just run through 3 or 4 of the different functions it helps us do. If I were to ask people, let me switch here to gallery view for a second. If I were to ask folks right here, I'm going to give you a phrase and I want you to repeat it silently in your head 3 times. Go blue. Okay, repeat that once, twice, 3 times. Can people shake if they were able to do that? Their head? All right. And did anyone feel really awful doing that because they're an Ohio State fan, by the way? Apologies if so. You've just used your inner voice. So our inner voice is part of what we call our verbal working memory system. It's a basic system in the mind that allows us to keep verbal information active. We use it all the time. When you remind yourself what's on your to-do list, or you go to the grocery store and think, hey, what do I have to buy? Cheese sticks, yogurt, milk, my grocery list. That's you using your inner voice. So that's a very fundamental role it plays in our lives. But then we use our inner voice to do lots of other things. Last week, I gave a presentation, and it was a high stakes event. And I went for a bike ride the day before, and I spent a good portion of the bike ride going over exactly what I was going to say during that presentation in my head. I went through the entire talk. When I was done, I heard the questions that the most obnoxious member of the audience was going to ask me. And then I responded in my head. I played all this out. In other words, I engaged in a mental simulation, and my inner voice helped me do that. We also use our inner voice to make sense of who we are. So when we experience adversity in our life, rejections, losses, we get angry at people, we often turn our attention inward to understand, well, why did that happen? What does that say about who I am as an individual? How can I move forward? And we use our inner voice to create those stories that help us make sense of our experiences in the world. So simulations, stories, keeping information active, controlling ourselves, these are basic tools that we rely on a daily basis, and your inner voice helps you do that. So that's all the beauty surrounding it. Now, it is often the case, however, that when we experience adversity and we try to activate this tool, our inner voice, it doesn't work so well. And it ends up morphing into chatter. We worry, we ruminate, we catastrophize, we get stuck in a negative thought loop that can be really debilitating. And you know, just to like give you what the stakes are with chatter, and I'm not trying to be hyperbolic by what I say next or exaggerate. Chatter, the negative consequences of chatter have been really well documented over the years. And they impact us in 3 domains of life that I think are part of what makes life really worth living. So they make it really hard for us to think and perform at work or in general, right? And part of the reason for that is chatter consumes our attention. We know attention is limited. And so when all of your attention is focused on what you're worried or ruminated about, it doesn't leave a whole lot of time over to focus on other things. If you've ever tried reading a few pages in a book while you're worried about something, only to get to the end of those pages and then think to yourself, I know I read this, but I don't remember a damn thing I just read. That's because chatter was consuming your attention. We also know that chatter creates friction in relationships, because what often happens is we go to other people to talk about our chatter, and then we keep on talking about it over and over and over again. And that could push away even the most well-intentioned friends and colleagues. And then finally, and I'll stop with the negatives after this, we know that chatter can also impact our physical health. And part of the way this works is when we experience a stress response, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually an adaptive response in small doses. But when stress becomes really toxic is when it becomes prolonged or chronic. And that's precisely what chatter does, right? We experience a stressor and then we think about it, we rehearse it over and over and over again, keeping that stress response activated over time in ways that predict things like cardiovascular disease, certain forms of cancer, and a host of other goblins of the body that we need not get into. So thinking, relationships, health. To me, chatter is one of the big problems we face as a species. And the good news is we don't have to suffer from it, because there are lots of science-based tools that exist to manage it.
And to put a point on the scale of this is something that you wrote about, is that we, on average, our verbal chatter or verbal dialogue, inner dialogue, equates to roughly 4,000 spoken words a minute, which is approximately one State of the Union that takes around 90 minutes. You're delivering that to yourself every minute that you are awake. And so if you think about the enormity of the conversations that you're having with yourselves, and that you can shape those or manage those for your to in a positive direction, or or they can funnel in a negative direction, you start to get a sense of like, wow, this is something that is worth taking action on and leading into. And we're going to discuss some of those tools that you can do that next. So, all right, Ethan. So I know we had talked about this earlier in the week, that sometimes there is an acute stressor that we fixate on. Maybe it's performance anxiety around talking in front of people, or maybe it's we have a fight with our spouse, something in acute. And then there's the chronic stressors. I've got chronic pain. I've got a pandemic that I'm sitting in for an indeterminate amount of time. Do you think about the tools differently, and what tool we bring to bear based on acute and chronic? And if so, maybe we start with one of those and start talking about some of the tools.
Well, some of the tools in this review of the literature I did, I came up with 26 different science-based tools that exist for managing chatter. I'm not going to go over all of them because that would be like, 45 seconds per tool, and it would do no one any good for me to go that quick. So I'll give you a few examples. Some of these tools have been studied in both acute and chronic stress contexts. Others have been studied in one versus the other. So it's a bit of a patchwork. One theme of the book and also of my work is that there are no single magic tools that work for all people across all situations. What science has done a pretty good job at doing is profiling how individual tools work under certain conditions. What we have yet to do compellingly is figure out how different tools work together to help people dealing with different kinds of situations. And that's something that we're doing a lot of research on in my lab right now, something that other people are doing. And I think it really gives people who are here, it provides an invitation to all of you to start doing some self-experimenting to try to figure out, hey, what's the unique combination of tools that serve me well, right? If you try a tool and it doesn't work for you, you don't like the way it works, like don't use it anymore. You really want to try thinking about what are the tools that work for me given my unique position here in life. So all that's pretty abstract. Let me start breaking this down concretely though, giving examples of tools. I like to think about them as falling into three different buckets: things you could do on your own, ways of leveraging our relationships with other people, and then environmental tools. And within each of those buckets, each of those categories, there are lots of individual tools. If we start with things you can do on your own, let me tell you about the two tools that I find myself relying on most. So one of the things we know about chatter is that it zooms us in on the problem really narrowly, right? Tunnel vision, we're focusing on the situation at hand very, very tightly in ways that prevent us from taking into account the broader picture, the bigger picture, which often provides us with different ways of thinking about our problems that can be useful. And so one tool for helping us zoom out and think about the problem from a more distant perspective, actually, it relies on language, and it involves trying to coach yourself through a problem using your own name and other non-first person pronouns, words like you. So when I'm really stressed out about something, I'll often think, all right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? One of the things we know from lots of research is that it's much easier for us to give advice to other people than it is for us to take our own advice. By a show of hands, has anyone here experienced a situation in which a friend or a loved one comes to you with a problem, they're ruminating, worrying, they don't know what to do, they present the problem to you, and it's easy for you to coach them through it? Use your real hands here, not your virtual hands. Okay, of the people on my screen, it looks like that's an almost unanimous response, and that's usually the case, right? It's much easier for us to weigh in when we have some distance from the situation. And what we've learned is that language can provide us a tool for giving us this perspective. If you think about it, most of the times that we use names and the second person pronoun you, we use those parts of speech when we think about and refer to other people. And so what we find is when you use your own name, it automatically switches your perspective. It turns you into your own coach, if you will, right? It allows you to start giving yourself advice like you would give to your best friend. And, I find it quite remarkable, actually, when you stop to think about what you often say to yourself when you're really struggling with a problem, when you're really being hypercritical. And just ask yourself, would you ever say that to your best friend if they came to you for advice about what to do? I mean, I'm amazed. A small anecdote here. A couple of weeks ago, I had a different presentation, and I sure hope no one from this presentation is on the call, because I'm going to say something. Anyway, I'm going to go into it. Basically, before this presentation, it was like I was an experiment in my own studies on trying to stress people out, because it was a high stakes presentation and the organizers kept on switching what they were asking me to do. One minute they wanted me to record the talk, the next they wanted me to do it live, then back to record, and then in the last minute, all right, just do it live. And so despite the fact that I've given countless talks over the years, I began to stress out a little bit. And the stuff I started thinking, oh my God, what if you sorry, the kids are on the phone, sorry. What if you screw up, blah, blah, blah. And then I stopped and I swear, Ethan, what are you doing? You've given thousands of talks. Literally, you've never sunk a talk. Why do you think it's going to happen here? It's going to go. And so I started coaching myself like I would a friend. But the things I was thinking to myself initially, I mean, I would never even articulate those thoughts to my wife, let alone someone who's coming to me for advice. And so I think there's a real lesson here. We call this, by the way, distanced self-talk. And it's one thing you can do. If you use the tool, I would encourage you to use it silently. You don't want to go outside talking to yourself out loud with your name. That violates some social convention in ways that can be problematic. So that's one tool you can use on your own. Let me tell you about one more, and then we'll pause before switching to another bucket. Another tool that I find myself relying on a lot, especially during the pandemic, is something we call temporal distancing, or you might think about it as mental time travel. And what it involves is thinking about how I'm going. Sorry, what was that called from Shelby Wilson? The tool I talked about first was called distanced self-talk. And this new tool that I'm talking about now, we'll call this mental time travel. And what it involves is thinking about how you're going to feel about an acute stressor that you're dealing with right now, sometime down the road in the future. So when the pandemic was at its worst for me, when I've got, two little kids basically taking Zoom calls at my ankles, I'm on Zoom and the tech isn't working, my wife is trying to do her work, there's 1,000 things going on. It's easy if you hyper focus on the awfulness, tunnel vision of the situation to get flustered. And so what I would often do is I would think, all right, Ethan, how are you going to feel about this 6 months from now? Once you're vaccinated, once you're back in the office, once the world is back on track. And when I would engage in that mental time travel, what that would do, it'd make it clear to me that what I'm going through right now, as awful as it is, it's temporary. It will eventually pass. And that gives us hope. And hope, we know, is a powerful bomb when it comes to an inner voice run amok. You don't just have to mental time travel into the future. I also went into the past quite a bit. I think about the pandemic of 1918, I think, which was the Spanish influenza, which was arguably worse than what we're dealing with right now, right? No Zoom, no takeout, medical infrastructure that was severely compromised compared to what we have now. And yet we got through that. We didn't just get through it. We came roaring back in the roaring 20s. We got through that. We'll get through this. It's temporary. So that's another, tool that you can use when you're struggling with chatter. And I often use those two interchangeably. So those are two examples of things you can do on your own. There are many others, but let me pause here to give Pat, if you want to jump in, or yeah. Andrew. I think I've lost you, Andrew, on my screen.
I think Andrew's struggling with the internet connectivity, so he's working to get back on right now. So we'll get him back on shortly. But two questions. One on the distance self-talk. One thing that you talk about in the book on this topic is that it's precognition. So by using your name or invoking a distant self-talk, it actually acts before you can even think about it, and it is having an effect on you, whether or not you realize it or not. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's going on there?
Well, what makes distant self-talk so useful, we think, based on the data we've collected so far, is in part how quickly it works. So we find that you can see reductions in emotional reactivity within milliseconds. And we think the reason for that is based on how tightly associated names are with thinking about other people, right? Most of the time, 99% of the time, although maybe this talk will change that statistic, but most of the time that we use names, we use them when we're thinking about and referring to other people. So that linkage is so tight that the idea is that when you use your own name to think about a problem, it's instantly activating the neural machinery that we use to think about other people. And that's switching the perspective very quickly, allowing us to get that psychological distance, which makes it easier for us to coach us through a problem.
That makes a lot of sense. That's very interesting. On the psychological distancing, one thing that seems to be a recurring theme, whether it's distant self-talk or time travel, is that you're creating a wedge between yourself and the stressor that you have, so that you can get more perspective and maybe come up with solutions or think through things differently. This is something that Andrew talks a lot about in his research, and looking at horizons or using panoramic vision to de-stress, de-escalate, and to be more calm and aware and present and ultimately effective. Does that resonate with you, or is that interesting to you at all? And this idea of creating more distance perspective, whether visually or psychologically, do you think that those things are connected?
Yeah, well, I don't think I can go so far as to say I know they're connected.
All right.
Actually, some of my earliest research focused on visual distancing and visual shifts. And the idea that what we found was that when people get stuck in chatter, they often replay experiences from their past that they're ruminating about from a first-person perspective. But if you ask them to take a fly on the wall perspective, basically step back and see themselves in the experience, see that person over there, now try to work through that person over there, that person's feelings, that makes it a lot easier for them to reason effectively. We also know that people who use distant self-talk, so if you tell a person to use their name, it makes them more likely to adopt that panoramic visual perspective. So what we're learning in science is that in the mind, these different dimensions of distance, linguistic, language distance, temporal distance, mental time travel, visual distance, they're all related. And they push, so if you distance on one metric, it pushes you around on the other one as well. But the key here, as you say, just big picture, no pun intended, is that when you're in the midst of chatter, it's all consuming, you're bathing in it. We use the term self-immersed to refer to the state of being totally, it's like you're bathing in the awfulness of life. And when that happens, the idea is, let's break you out, have you step back just a little bit, not so you avoid thinking about the problem, but so that you step back just so you can see a little bit of the bigger picture, give you a little bit more perspective, which can often be really helpful. I'll just say one little, there's so much I want to squeeze in the limited time we have with everyone. One other little tidbit tip. Distance isn't always going to be good for you. And what I mean by that is the following. We find that it's quite useful when you're stuck in chatter and you're dealing with adversity. But on the flip side, if you're experiencing an amazing positive moment, so I coach my daughter's soccer team. We're at the soccer field yesterday, and it was really just this wonderful experience. We're all having fun and yelling and in a positive way. And the last thing you want to do in that situation is distance. You don't want to zoom out there. Then you want to be fully immersed and engaged. So, zoom in for the positive, zoom out for the negative.
Yeah, it's so important. Something we talk a lot about at Madefor, recognizing and celebrating the wins when you have them, savor them.
That's right.
And the more you practice that, the better you get at it. So that's really, really, really fascinating. Okay, maybe we shift to this other bucket and how you think about chatter and as it relates to others and our role, our role in that dialogue between other people, maybe stuck in chatter or for ourselves.
Yeah, so let's talk about the people tool bucket, which is one of my favorite topics and chapters in my book. Lots of people think that lots of people, first of all, feel when they're experiencing chatter, they want to talk to other people about it to get some help. There are a couple of exceptions to this rule. People tend not to want to talk about experience involving shame and certain forms of trauma. They instead usually try to avoid those experiences. But other experiences, anxiety, anger, depression, we often go to others for help. Now, many people think that venting or expressing your emotions to someone else, that this is the way to manage chatter. Find someone else to talk to and just unload. What research shows is that it is more complicated than that. Simply venting your emotions to another person, such as letting it out, what this does is it makes this is great for establishing close connections between two individuals. So it's nice to know that there's someone out there who's willing to take the time to actually listen to my problems, right? So when you vent about an experience, that the research shows that strengthens our friendship bonds between two individuals. But if all you do is vent, right, what often happens is you leave that conversation feeling really good about my relationship with the person I just talked to, but you're lit up about the problem that you came to them in the first place, because all you've done is regurgitated in your mind over and over and over again. And so venting tends to predict more anxiety, more depression over time. What the best kinds of conversations do when it comes to chatter is two things. First, it is important to do a little bit of venting, a little bit of expressing. Like, Pat, you and I are buddies right now, and I come to you with a problem. You need to learn about what I've gone through to be able to engage me effectively, right? And it's good to know that you're willing to take the time to listen. But ideally, at a certain point in our conversation, what you do for me is you cue me to try to broaden my perspective. So you're trying to get me to think more objectively about the situation. So you might say, all right, Ethan, well, you've done countless presentations before. You must have had a few that didn't go so well. How'd you deal with those? Or here's how I deal with this situation. So essentially what you're doing is you're cueing me to broaden my perspective. And that's really the two-step process that explains effective chatter support when someone comes to you for advice. You take the time to listen and really engage and hear the person out. But at a certain point in the conversation, you start nudging them to think about the bigger picture, to try to help them broaden their perspective. And the take-home point I like to give to people is what knowing about this science empowers you to do is it allows you to be a lot more deliberate about who you seek chatter support from in your life. There are a lot of people in my life that I love dearly and that I know love me. I know this because DNA determines it, right? We're related, we're very close. I don't talk to them about my chatter because I know what they're going to do is they're going to show support, but it's going to end there. And I'm going to leave that conversation just as upset as when I started. So instead I think about, well, who are the people in my life that are really skilled at not only listening, but also chiming in and helping to advise me through the situation. There are like 3 people I go to for personal problems, 4 for professional, and that's like my personal board of advisors, and I really take advantage of them. So think about that before you talk to someone. And on the flip side, if someone comes to you for help, be mindful of helping them, of doing both of these things, listening, but also helping broaden their perspective.
Amazing. I think Andrew is back with us. I just want to confirm, Andrew, are you there?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely here. Hopefully I'm coming through. I've been enjoying the conversation. Sorry for the technical issues. I have 2 quick questions. One is I have a good childhood friend who just so happens became a neurosurgeon. He studies speech and language, and he's always, he studies the human brain and speech and language. And he's always telling me that speech and language are 2 different things. And I'm wondering whether or not we can think of our chatter in the context of speech and language, the actual cadence being speech, the the tonality of it, the same way that we would talk to each other right now, using inflection, or how much of the quality of the way that we speak, as opposed to just the content of the word. So the way we speak and what we're actually saying, how much of that influence the impact that chatter could have?
That's a great question, and we don't actually have science-based answers to perfectly nail that. What we know is that chatter can take different forms, and inner speech, if you will, can take different forms, and it can range from being extremely condensed, almost like thinking in shorthand notes. That's how you get the rate of what scientists, people call it inner speech. You might quibble with using that term, but self-talk can be really, really fast and fragmented, just like our shorthand notes in a lecture might be very fragmented and indiscernible to someone else. Or at the other end of the extreme, we could think to ourselves in full sentences, much like we would talk to other people in these kinds of audible exchanges. Anecdotally, if I think back to some of the data that we've collected, where we do these think aloud protocols, where we ask people to articulate the stream of thoughts flowing through their mind under different conditions, chatter versus adaptive self-reflection, what does strike me is that the chatter tends to be much more fragmented. If there are any kids in the audience now, cover their ears, but I'm thinking about one thought record where we had a person think about a time when they were really upset. And when we asked them to tell us what was streaming through your head as we asked you to work through these feelings, anger, pissed off, victimized, betrayed, pissed off, shitted on, humiliated. It was like this rapid fire of emotion words. And then when you look at the people who are thinking more deliberately about this due to these distancing manipulations, they're telling stories. They're telling coherent, almost poetic stories with punctuation. And so how we talk to ourselves can take a lot of different forms. Whether chatter is always that fragmented, D+ grade on grammar, that I can't tell you with authority, but it certainly does vary. There's one other interesting association that your question raises, Andrew, that I want to very quickly touch on, maybe just 60 seconds, because I still want to say a few other things. In my book, I actually tell the story of a person who experienced a stroke that affected her left hemisphere and her ability to use language. And so she stopped being able to communicate with other people using words. And she also stopped for a while being able to talk to herself. Really interesting case study on what happens when you lose your inner voice. What's fascinating about her experience is, at first she describes the experience as euphoric, because while her words left her, so did all of her worries and ruminations. She was very verbal in her ability to engage in how she engaged in these worries. And that was just like the best, the best anxiolytic medication you could possibly take, just wipe it out. But as the days went on, she often described the experience she was having as also strangely vacuous. Right? It was an empty experience because her worries went away, but so did her ability to use language to author the story of her life, to make sense of her experience. And so she actually regained her linguistic capacity. There's a nice ending to the story. And the take home is that she realizes that the challenge is not to silence the inner voice, which so many people, I think, that's the goal. Rather, it is to harness it, which is an approach that resonates with me. All right, we tackled one of your questions. That was not a quick question, or maybe your question was quick, but my answer was not. Let me hear the second question, then we'll figure out if to take it or not.
No, thank you for that very thorough and informative answer, because I think it's something that I've pondered for a bit as we've having this discussion. The second question also comes from my friend who told me who works on speech and language. He said there's this amazing discovery in the field of neurosurgery, which is that the representation of the hands, I've been watching your hands this whole hour, the representation of the hands is essentially interdigitated, no pun intended, with the representation of speech. And I'm wondering if I talk to, let's say I'm trying to generate maybe a slower cadence, complete sentence, inner dialogue that would allow me to parse something challenging or to turn off the negative chatter. Do you think there's any value to actually engaging the hands and pacing oneself? I'd probably look ridiculous to people, or unless I'm alone in my home, but we see it when people speak, that their hands are engaged, especially the Italians, but all cultures, right?
The Jews do it too.
Everyone, and people.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in. It's a fantastic question. You're going to think I'm putting you on here, but actually we have actually talked with. There's a psychologist named Susan Golden Meadow, a very well-known scientist at the University of Chicago, who studies gestures, and what she shows is that gesturing often facilitates cognition. It's very closely related. So when we use our hands, it facilitates thinking in very interesting ways. And so what we've actually talked about doing is looking to see how different forms of self-talk, in particular, distant self-talk. All right, Ethan, how are you going to manage a situation versus what am I going to do in this situation? Whether those linguistic shifts have demonstrable implications for how we gesture and how those two go hand in hand. So it's a wonderful question. We don't know exactly how the two are wedded together, but we know that they certainly are. Okay.
Amazing. Let's dive into your third bucket, Ethan. Environmental.
Okay. Environmental. But wait, I need to give a quick disclaimer on the people tools before I go into environmental. So I want Andrew or Pat, stopwatch 90 seconds, okay? So what I told you before has to do with when a person comes to you and asks you, hey, I experienced something problematic. Help me out here. That's one situation. There's another situation that is important to just give you a sense of, which is a situation in which you see someone in your life struggling, your kids, your colleagues, your loved ones, but they don't ask you for help. The question there is, what do you do? Do you try to broaden their perspective and give that chatter support or not? Research shows that if you volunteer support without being asked for it, it tends to blow up in your face. So consistently, there are these studies which show like two members of a couple, one person is struggling, someone else volunteers some help. If it's not being asked for, it makes the person who you're trying to give the support to feel bad because they're interpreting your attempt to help as a threat to your self-efficacy. It's like when my parents say, hey, you're going away. Why don't you make sure to rent this car, take out insurance, and make sure your kids are, blah, blah, blah. Did I ask you for help? Do you not think I'm a good parent? So that's the dynamic that's being activated. In those situations, there are still ways you can help, and we call it invisible support. What it involves is getting people the support and advice they need, but without shining a spotlight on their inadequacies. So concrete example, my wife's at her wit's end with work, stuff at home, the kids, right? She's struggling. I pick up the dry cleaning. I get the groceries. I make dinner without being asked. I do things to ease her burden without actually being asked to do it. If a graduate student's really struggling in my lab with their writing or presentation skills, right? Rather than emailing them and say, hey, you need to read this book because you need to improve your skills. Instead, I might send a message to the entire lab. Hey, everyone, I just read this book. You might want to check it out. Really great tips. Or there's a talk on campus. Let's all go to it. I'm getting them the information they need, but without shining that spotlight on their own inadequacies in that moment. Invisible support, and it's another piece of the chatter puzzle. And so I'll how did I do? 90 seconds?
97 seconds, you're good.
Would that cut it in still training though, or would I be done?
It depends if there was a bomb on the end of the fuse.
All right, well, I'm not asking that question again. All right, so environmental tools. I find this stuff just fascinating, right? There are ways of regulating what's happening inside our heads by interacting with our environments in particular ways. And there's a lot of science behind this. Rafael Nadal, right? One of the greatest tennis players of all time. If you've ever watched him play the game, you know what he does is he engages in these wacky routines. Like before every serve, he flips his hair behind his ear, picks a wedgie out of his butt, bounces a ball a few times. Like he engages in this elaborate ritual. A ritual is a rigid, ordered sequence of behaviors. It's something you do the exact same way every single time. And when asked why he does this, he says, well, the hardest thing I battle to do on a tennis court is battle the voices inside my head. In and of itself, by the way, I think that's fascinating, right? Like here you've got one of the best tennis players of all time. Hardest thing he struggles with is not his opponent's backhand, it's the voice inside his head. When asked why he engages in these rituals, he says, they provide me with a sense of order to match the order I seek in my head. When we're experiencing chatter, we often feel like we don't have control of our mind, of our thoughts. And what we've learned is that you can compensate for that experience by ordering your surroundings, by creating order around you. Tidying up and organizing is one way to do it. Engaging in an ordered sequence of behaviors of the ritual sort is another. And so those are a few concrete things you can do to manage chatter when it erupts. You, of course, don't want to take this to an extreme. Any tool used excessively can become harmful. And there are associations, of course, with rituals and OCD. So we're not talking about over-relying on this tool, but in small doses, this can be very effective. One or two other very quick environmental tools, and then I'll turn it back over to you. Interacting with nature, green spaces. When we experience chatter, it consumes our attention. What a lot of research shows is that if you can find a safe green space to go for a walk in or interact in, and I say safe as an aside because I grew up in a part of Brooklyn where green spaces, parks were synonymous with danger and threat. And so I don't encourage you to go into those kinds of spaces. But if you find a safe park or tree-lined neighborhood to take a walk in, what research shows happen is our attention naturally drifts away from our chatter and onto the subtly intriguing shrubs and trees and flowers around us. So our attention drifts away and is subtly captured by those we call them stimuli, those things in our environment. And that gives us the opportunity to replenish our attention that we often need to focus on the task at hand or to later combat our chatter. So green spaces can be useful in that way. They can also be useful, and this is the last thing I'll tell you about, is by promoting the experience of awe. Awe is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast that we have trouble explaining. A beautiful horizon, trees that have been here 300 years. How have they weathered hurricanes and storms and tornadoes and blah, blah, blah. When we experience awe, what happens is we experience something called a shrinking of the self. When we're pondering something really vast and indescribable, our own concerns feel a whole lot smaller by comparison. And that makes it easier for us to manage our chatter. And the cool thing about awe is, although you often get it from a natural environment like a green space, you could also get awe from other places. Like the most powerful awe experience I had recently was watching the Mars rover land on Mars. Like I have just in the last few years understood how we fly planes. I've always been amazed at how we blast people off into the air and safely land them. Now I've got to contemplate interplanetary travel, right? We landed an SUV with a small helicopter in the roof on another planet and sending us pictures. Fills me with awe and really puts, my rejections from journals and other kinds of things in perspective. And so lots of places you can find awe. So those are a few environmental tools. The beauty of all of this is there are tools all around us, right? And so it's no single tool that I think is going to work for every person and situation. Instead, it's finding the right combination. I'm going to stop talking now and turn it back to you.
It's amazing. It's amazing. There's so much to get through and so many great tools. But I think this is a really good taste of the 3 different buckets. And obviously, all of these tools are discussed at length in Ethan's book if you're interested in learning more about these. But I think maybe we'll shift to questions now because there's some really good ones coming in from members. The first one comes from Jonathan. And Jonathan asks, how do we distinguish between our own self-talk versus the internalized voices of others, such as families, partners, teachers, maybe bullies we've encountered in the past? Maybe to Ethan for that.
Yeah, well, they're all your self-talk. And one important thing to know to distinguish is that if you're hearing, like I can hear my mother right now. You don't want to hear what she's saying to me because it's often laden with some expletives, but I can hear her voice. But that's a simulation. And I'm aware that in fact, is my brain conjuring up this voice of my mom inside. And so I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, that we are capable of hearing other people's voices. And that's the beauty of the mind, the beauty of the brain, that it allows us to represent other people in our mind. It is not a divine intervention. Interestingly, 10-second aside, historically cultures have really struggled with this issue because, way back when, before there were experiments and fMRIs and things of that sort, a lot of people didn't, they were capable of hearing other voices, but then the question became, well, what does that mean? Is this other person in my head? Is that me? Is that God? And so, this takes us a little bit into the domain of auditory hallucinations, which is a fascinating topic. But the take home is you can represent other people's voices with a high degree of fidelity in your own mind.
Amazing. The next question from Elver relates to maybe visual chatter. So he asked, what about visual images? I have severe OCD and sometimes my brain goes on a loop and disturbing images occur. Can I think about this in the same way I do chatter, or you do chatter? Are there any tools to deal with this when it happens?
Yeah, so worry and rumination is by no means it tends to be verbal, but we can often see images in our mind too that can be the source of great distress. A lot of the tools that I talk about, that I've talked about, work with both kinds of experiences. Our experiences with chatter aren't always cleanly binned into the verbal versus imagistic domain. Sometimes they spill into one another, and the tools have been studied in that context. Mm-hmm. So again, and I forget the name of the person who asked this excellent question, but try the tool. These are easy to implement tools, and if they serve you well, keep using them. If they don't, switch to a different tool.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Question from Renee, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but she asked about chatter for something positive and the impact of that. She said, for example, I just booked a vacation and can't stop thinking about it. I even lost a night of sleep after I booked it. I know you mentioned that when we have positive experiences, we want to lean into those, savor them. Are there any tips or tools or things that you would recommend to help us with that savoring or extend that so we get longer effects of the positive experiences that we have?
Yeah. Well, first of all, and it was Renee, right?
Renee, yeah.
Renee. So I wouldn't call that chatter. I think of chatter as always the bad stuff. What you're describing to me is part of what makes life so much fun to experience, which is the good stuff, and fantasizing about those experiences. If it cuts into your sleep in a major way, that might be a little bit problematic, but other than that, savoring is great. To savor something, what you want to do is the opposite of what I talked about earlier. Rather than take the big picture and step back in distance, you want to zoom in and immerse yourself. Think really concretely about what it is you're excited about. So, the taste of that pina colada, the feel of the sand between your toes on the beach as the sun hits your face before you get a sunburn, obviously. So like really, really concrete and visceral. That's the signature for savoring.
Amazing, amazing, love it. Okay, next question from Brian. How can one stay consistent in certain practices like meditation while also dealing with negative chatter? So maybe the chatter is overtaking his mind when he's trying to engage in what otherwise might be a positive practice.
Well, the idea behind meditation is a practice that has been linked with lots of benefits when it comes to chatter. The idea is you want to, don't get down on yourself if you find that focusing on your mantra, you just stop focusing on it because your mind drifts somewhere else. The moment you become aware of the fact that your mind has drifted, bring it back to your mantra. And over time, with repeated practice, you'll get better at doing that. That's how meditation works. The point I'd like to get in there is meditation is often described as and this is not necessarily by the people teaching or studying meditation, but I think by our culture as a kind of panacea, right? Be in the moment, mindfulness, meditate. I think of mindfulness or meditation as one kind of tool amidst many others. And I don't think people should limit themselves to any individual tool. We actually just did a big study that looked at coping with COVID-19, and we profiled the different strategies people use on a daily basis over 2 weeks in a nationally representative sample. And what we found, and meditation was in there, no single tool really moved the needle on people's anxiety. But using combinations of tools, people who used healthy combinations of tools, the people who used the healthiest combination experienced a 30% reduction in daily anxiety compared to the people who used the least healthy tools. And by least healthy tools, I mean things like drinking, suppression, venting. So it's really about thinking in terms of these cocktails of tools rather than individual ones.
Awesome. So good. Yeah, you talk, there's a whole part in your book where you talk about that everyone holds up being present as the perfect state of being, and that everything should be focused on being present. But you make a very good point that our brains are designed to be in the past and to be in the future and to be in the present. And it's how we toggle between those states effectively in a way that best serves us. And that's really what we're looking for. So
yeah. And one way of another way of just giving you how I think about this, we can go back in time or forward in time or be in the present. Remarkable ability, learn from mistakes, plan for the future. Often we get stuck in the past or the future.
Mm-hmm.
One very blunt solution to that is that, okay, just go back in the present and stay in the present. But what we've learned is that tools exist to help you just travel in time more effectively in your head. Tools exist to help you not get stuck. And I think being fluid in how we can use our mind and travel is really empowering and a more sophisticated way of approaching the problem that is life than giving us what I think is an unattainable goal of always being in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Question from Michelle. This is an interesting one. So Michelle does not think that she has an internal dialogue. Is it possible to not have inner chatter?
Well, if you have, I would love to ask Michelle if she was able to do that exercise that I started with, like repeating the words "go blue, go blue, go blue." If you have language, the ability to talk, you should be able to do that exercise. And so one of the reasons I like to start with talking about the different functions that the inner voice serves is to make the point that there's variability in how much we lean on our inner voice to serve different functions. And so, maybe you, I forgot the name one more time.
Michelle,
you may not engage in conversations with yourself, but I would venture to guess that you are capable of reminding yourself of what's on your to-do list when you go to the grocery store. And so you still have an inner voice, right? You still have this capacity to silently use language, but you are not using it to weave together these stories that explain who you are. And I think there's variability at that end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. I know I want to be sensitive to people's schedule and time. We've covered a lot of ground. Maybe we'll go around the horn for any final thoughts, and then I'll wrap up. But we'll go to Ethan. Is there anything that you want people to walk away from? Like one point you want someone to walk away from this time?
One point is so hard. It's like asking like
what is your part? What would be your parting thought?
The main point is, if you experience chatter, congratulations. Welcome to the human condition. You're not alone. Most of us do at times. And the good news is that there are lots of science-based tools that exist to help us manage it. No single magic pills, but lots of tools that collectively can really move the needle to help us manage this kind of adversity in ways that I think have the potential to improve people's lives.
Amazing. Andrew, parting thought.
Well, I've just been soaking all this amazing knowledge in. I think for me, I'm starting to realize that paying attention to the structure and content of the inner voice is something that I would like to do more of. I just sort of let it run on autopilot, and I'm hesitant to ask another question, but I've noticed that my chatter changes across the day, if I'm fatigued versus if I'm, alert, if I've had too much coffee, et cetera. And so I'm going to start paying attention to how my physiological state and the time of day changes that chatter, just to kind of an experiment. And because I think there's a lot of richness of information in this inner voice. And thank you, Ethan, for cueing our attention to this, what's clearly a powerful aspect of our inner landscape.
Awesome. All right. Well, we always like to end these base camps with a takeaway and a way that you can get into action. And we recognize that nothing has changed as a result of our time together today. But if you go out of this and you get into action, then something may change. And if you're running experiments, they can change in your favor. So whether you zoom out, whether you time travel, whether you use distant self-talk, or you say, yo, Patty, I was wrong, figure out what works for you. Ethan talks about in his book that this idea that you have a toolbox, and it's on you to figure out the right combination of tools that's most effective for you. Be your own best teammate. You deserve it. So thank you, Ethan, and most importantly to our members and for everyone that engaged in our mental health challenge for tuning in and being here. We're so grateful for the work you do every day to bring out the best in yourself and the best in those around you. And for those that aren't currently members, we're closing our June class here in a few days. So if you're interested in signing up, we'd love to have you on board. And then last but not least, this is Ethan's book, Chatter. You can find it online, and check out Ethan on Instagram. He's got a lot of great content out there as well. So thank you all for being here for the time. I hope you have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we look forward to talking again soon. Take care, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
Cheers.